Welcome, dear listener. Tonight we begin a journey through time, a journey across the long stretch of the Middle Ages in England. This is not a tale to be rushed or studied as one would a lesson, but instead a gentle wandering. You do not need to keep each name, each battle, or each year held tightly in your mind. Simply let them drift, like leaves carried along a slow-moving river. Imagine the setting. The sun is setting over the English countryside. Rolling green fields fade into the distance, dotted with small villages where smoke rises from thatched roofs. Church bells toll in the distance, calling villagers to prayer. The air is heavy with the smell of wood smoke, of damp earth, and of bread baking in ovens. This is England long ago, in what we now call the Middle Ages. Our journey will move through centuries, from the days after Rome's collapse, when Anglo-Saxon kingdoms carved out their homes in the misty land, through the Norman conquest and the rise of stone castles, into the Plantagenet age of law and rebellion, across the flowering of cathedrals and learning, through plague and war, and finally into the bitter struggle of the Wars of the Roses. But tonight, you need not worry about where you are on the path. Simply allow the story to guide you step by step. Some moments will be vivid, the clash of shields, the chants of monks, the laughter of peasants at a village fair. Others will be quiet, a candle flickering in a monastery cell, the soft turning of parchment, or the hush of fields at twilight. As you listen, notice how the centuries rise and fall like waves on the sea. The people of medieval England, kings and queens, monks and knights, peasants and merchants, are long gone. But their world still whispers to us through stone ruins, worn manuscripts, and the echoes of old legends. And so let us close our eyes, breathe deeply, and step softly back into the 5th century, when England was no longer Roman but not yet united, a land of shifting kingdoms, of raiders from the sea, of prayers whispered in Latin, and the quiet resilience of ordinary folk. This is where our story begins. When the Roman legions departed Britain around the year 410, they left behind empty forts, crumbling villas, and abandoned roads. For centuries, Britain had been part of the vast Roman Empire. Soldiers guarded its walls, merchants traded in its towns, and farmers tilled the land for a distant emperor. But as Rome weakened, its legions were called away, never to return. Into this vacuum came new peoples. Across the North Sea, tribes known as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes sailed in wooden boats. They came first as mercenaries, hired to defend against raiders, but soon they carved out their own kingdoms. Imagine their ships, narrow, sturdy, carrying warriors with spears and shields. They landed on misty shores, their sails snapping in the wind. Over time, these newcomers spread across much of what we now call England. They built wooden halls, cleared forests for farms, and gave their names to the land itself. Angle land, come England. Villages grew, clustered around rivers and fields. Life was simple, ruled by the rhythm of seasons, sowing in spring, harvesting in autumn. The long, dark winters passed by the hearth. These were the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex in the south, Mercia in the Midlands, Northumbria in the north, East Anglia along the coast. Each had its own kings, its warriors, and its shifting alliances. And yet alongside the harshness of war and survival, there was also beauty. Christianity slowly returned, carried by missionaries. Monks built monasteries, where prayer was constant and books were carefully copied. In stone cloisters under candlelight, scribes bent over parchment, preserving not only scripture but also poetry and learning. The famous story of Beowulf was told in this age, of monsters, heroes, and the fragile triumph of courage over darkness. But peace was often broken. From the late 700s, dark ships appeared once again on the horizon. The Vikings had come, fierce raiders from Norway and Denmark. They struck monasteries and villages with sudden violence. The church at Lindisfarne was among the first to fall. Its treasures looted, its monks slaughtered or enslaved. For decades, England lived in fear of these seaborne raiders. Imagine the terror of villagers watching the horizon, knowing that the sight of dragon-proud ships meant fire, loss, and despair. Yet the Vikings were not only destroyers. Many settled in the land they once raided, farming, trading, and blending with the English. It was during these troubled times that one man rose as a beacon of hope: Alfred the Great, King of Wessex. Unlike many rulers of his age, Alfred combined military skill with wisdom. He built fortified towns known as burhs to protect his people. He reorganized his armies, ensuring that part of his forces were always ready for battle. And when peace allowed, he encouraged learning, translating important works into English so that his people could read them. Picture Alfred not only as a warrior king, but also as a thoughtful scholar, seated in a wooden hall by candlelight, a book open on his lap while the wind howled outside. His reign laid the foundation for a united England. As the centuries passed, England grew more stable. The Anglo-Saxon kings slowly extended their power, and by the 10th century, the kingdom was closer to unity. Villages flourished, trade increased, and Christianity shaped the rhythm of life. A peasant's day began with the ringing of the church bell, carried on through hard labor in the fields, and ended with prayers at dusk. Even so, the Vikings returned again and again, sometimes as conquerors. In the early 11th century, England even had Viking kings. Not the Great, a Danish ruler, became King of England in 1016. His reign was surprisingly peaceful, remembered for its balance of cultures, Norse and Anglo-Saxon blending under one crown. But history is never still. By the mid-11th century, the old line of Anglo-Saxon kings was faltering. Edward the Confessor, deeply pious but politically weak, left no heir. When he died in 1066, the question of who should wear England's crown would open the door to one of the most famous events in history. But before we turn to that chapter, pause for a moment. Imagine yourself in an Anglo-Saxon village at dusk. Smoke rises from hearth fires. Children play with simple wooden toys. The sound of animals drifts through the air. Sheep bleating, dogs barking, geese calling. A mother weaves at her loom while her family eats bread and pottage, a simple stew. Beyond the wooden palisade lies the dark forest, vast and mysterious. This was England before the Normans, a land of small kingdoms, of fierce battles and quiet faith, of warriors and monks, of raiders and rulers, a land both fragile and resilient, always waiting for what the next tide might bring. And so, with the death of Edward the Confessor, we leave behind the Anglo-Saxon age, and we turn to the year 1066, when England would be transformed forever. The year is 1066, and the future of England hangs in the balance. The death of King Edward the Confessor has left the throne without a clear heir. Edward had no children, and though he was revered as a saintly king, his lack of succession planning left a dangerous vacuum. In January of that year, the nobles of England crowned Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in the realm, as king. Harold was tall, strong, and respected, the son of the mighty Godwin, Earl of Wessex. Yet his claim was not uncontested. Across the sea in Normandy, a duke named William believed that Edward had promised him the crown. To the north, the Viking king Harald Hardrada of Norway also laid claim, hoping to revive Old Norse rule in England. And so 3 men prepared to seize a single crown. The first threat, Vikings' return. Before William could act, the north erupted. In September, Harald Hardrada sailed with a fleet of Viking warriors. His ships, sleek and carved with dragons, cut across the cold waters of the North Sea. The invasion was fierce. At the Battle of Fulford near York, the English earls were defeated. The north seemed lost, but Harold Godwinson moved quickly. He marched his army north at astonishing speed, covering nearly 200 miles in just days. On September 25th, Harold faced the Viking invaders at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Imagine the scene: the English shield wall standing firm, the Viking warriors roaring their defiance. A lone Norseman, armed with a great axe, held the narrow bridge against the English, cutting down foe after foe until at last he was slain. The battle raged through the day, and in the end, Harold Hardrada was struck by an arrow to the throat. The Viking army was broken. It seemed the old menace of the north had been vanquished. But Harold's victory came at a cost. His men were exhausted and their numbers diminished. And even as they rested, news arrived that would change everything. William of Normandy had landed in the south. The Norman landing. On the morning of September 28th, William's fleet touched the shores of Sussex. Hundreds of ships carried knights, horses, archers, and supplies. They built a wooden castle at Hastings, establishing a base. William waited, knowing Harold must come to face him. And Harold came, marching once again. His weary army reached Hastings on October 13th. The next day, on October 14th, the two sides prepared for battle. The Battle of Hastings. Dawn broke over the fields near Hastings. On one side stood Harold's army, mostly infantry, men with axes, spears, and shields. They formed a great shield wall, locking their shields together on the hilltop, determined to hold. On the other side stood William's Normans, disciplined knights on horseback, archers, and infantry. The Normans had trained for years in the art of war, and William himself was a seasoned commander. The battle began with arrows whistling through the sky, but the English shield wall held. Norman cavalry charged up the hill, but the English axes cut down horses and riders alike. For hours, the shield wall stood unbroken, but William was cunning. He ordered his men to feign retreat. Some English broke ranks, chasing the fleeing Normans, only to be cut down as the cavalry wheeled back. Slowly, gaps opened in the English line. As the sun sank lower, the end came. A hail of arrows fell, and one is said to have struck Harold in the eye. Whether by arrow or sword, Harold fell, and with him, England's defense collapsed. The shield wall crumbled. The Normans pressed forward, and by nightfall, the field belonged to William. The Battle of Hastings was over, and with it, the Anglo-Saxon age. William the Conqueror. William marched to London, facing scattered resistance but no strong rival. On Christmas Day of 1066, in Westminster Abbey, he was crowned King of England. The shouts of "God save the King" inside the abbey alarmed his guards, who thought a riot had broken out. They set fire to nearby houses and chaos swept the city. Yet William remained calm, his crown placed firmly on his head. William would be known as the Conqueror, and his rule would transform England. Castles and control. The Normans brought with them a new vision of power. Across the land, they built stone castles, not only fortresses, but symbols of dominance. Where once stood wooden halls, now rose towers of stone. Motte and Bailey castles, perched high on mounds looking down upon the countryside. Imagine walking near one of these new castles in the 11th century. The wooden palisade is replaced by stone walls, high and unyielding. A drawbridge crosses a moat. Soldiers watch from battlements, bows in hand. For the villagers below, the castle was a reminder that a new lord now ruled their lives. William also reshaped landholding. The feudal system bound nobles to the king, each owing military service in return for land. The great Anglo-Saxon lords were stripped of power, replaced by Norman barons loyal to William. A new aristocracy rose, speaking French in their halls, while peasants continued to speak Old English. The Domesday Book. In 1086, William ordered a great survey of his realm. The Domesday Book. It recorded every piece of land, every village, every plow and pig, every mill and meadow. Nothing was too small. To the people, it seemed as if nothing could escape the king's gaze. The Domesday Book was not only a record, but a tool of control. It allowed William to know the wealth of his kingdom and to tax it effectively. In its pages, we glimpse medieval England in astonishing detail. The size of villages, the crops they grew, the lives they lived. Daily life under the Normans. For the ordinary people of England, life changed slowly yet deeply. Villagers still worked the land bound to their lord. Fields were plowed with oxen, grain ground at the mill, bread baked in village ovens. But now, they owed their labor and loyalty to Norman lords. In the towns, trade grew. Markets bustled with merchants selling cloth, salt, and wine. Stone churches rose beside wooden houses, and in the courts, justice was dispensed in French. Slowly, languages blended, giving birth to the English tongue we know today. The Norman conquest was more than a change of kings. It was the birth of a new England. The old Anglo-Saxon order was swept aside, replaced by castles, cathedrals, and a ruling elite from across the sea. Yet beneath these changes, the rhythms of life continued. The fields still bloomed in spring, the bells still rang on holy days, children still played in village lanes. History shifted above, but the quiet persistence of daily life endured. As you rest now, imagine standing on a hill in the 11th century. Behind you, a Norman castle rises, its stone walls glowing in the fading light. Below, the village smoke drifts upward, and the sound of bells echoes across the valley. England has entered a new age, an age of kings, of lords, of feudal power. And soon this world will be shaped by a dynasty that would rule for centuries, the Plantagenets. With the Normans firmly established, England entered a new age under the descendants of William the Conqueror. By the mid-12th century, a powerful dynasty had taken root, the Plantagenets. Their rule would stretch across centuries, shaping the very fabric of English law, culture, and identity. The rise of Henry II. Our story begins with Henry II, who became king in 1154. He was a man of restless energy, clever, determined, and ambitious. Henry inherited not only England but vast lands in France through his family. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most influential women in Europe, expanded his power even further. Imagine a royal court filled with music, poetry, and sharp debate. Eleanor was no passive queen. She had been Queen of France before, and she brought with her a love of art, troubadour songs, and refined culture. Together, Henry and Eleanor created what some called an empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But Henry's reign was not without turmoil. He quarreled with his nobles, with the church, and even with his own family. One of the most famous conflicts was with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Once Henry's close friend, Becket became his bitter opponent, resisting the king's attempts to control the church. Their quarrel ended tragically in 1170, when knights loyal to Henry murdered Becket inside Canterbury Cathedral. The shocking crime sent ripples through Christendom. Becket was soon declared a saint, and pilgrims began to flock to Canterbury. Even today, the shrine of Thomas Becket remains, a symbol of faith and resistance against royal power. Richard the Lionheart. After Henry, his son Richard I, known as the Lionheart, became king. Richard was celebrated as a warrior, a crusader who spent little time in England itself. His courage and military brilliance were legendary, but his reign left the kingdom heavily taxed to fund his wars in the Holy Land. Picture Richard in shining armor, his banner fluttering as he rode into battle under the scorching sun of the Middle East. His fame was immense, but for the ordinary people of England, his absence meant burden. His rule was like a bright, fierce flame, brief but unforgettable. King John and the Magna Carta. When Richard died in 1199, his brother John took the throne. John's reign was troubled from the start. He lost vast lands in France, angering the barons who had fought to defend them. His heavy taxation and arbitrary rule deepened resentment. John quarreled with the Pope, leading to England being placed under a papal interdict. Churches closed, bells silenced, sacraments withheld. For the faithful, this was a terrifying punishment. The crisis reached its peak in 1215. The barons, weary of John's failures and tyranny, rose in rebellion. At Runnymede by the River Thames, they confronted the king. Under pressure, John agreed to place his seal upon a charter, the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. At first, it was simply a peace treaty between king and nobles, but its words carried a deeper meaning, that the king was not above the law, that he must rule with justice, and that his subjects had rights to be respected. Over centuries, the Magna Carta grew in importance, becoming a symbol of liberty, echoed in later struggles for freedom across the world. But in 1215, it was simply a fragile truce. John soon broke his promises, plunging the kingdom back into war. He died a year later, leaving his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to inherit the crown. Everyday life in Plantagenet, England. As kings and barons quarreled, ordinary life unfolded with a slower rhythm. Imagine a medieval village in the 13th century. Fields spread out in strips, shared by peasants who plowed with oxen. Thatched cottages lined muddy lanes. Life was hard, ruled by the seasons and by custom. Children worked alongside their parents, tending animals or carrying water. Bread was the staple food, baked in shared ovens, sometimes flavored with herbs or cheese. On feast days, villagers celebrated with music, dancing, and simple games. Religion shaped every aspect of existence. Church bells rang out daily, calling people to prayer. The year was marked by holy days and festivals. Easter, Christmas, the Feast of Saints. Life was short, often harsh, but held together by faith and community. In towns, life was different. Markets bustled with merchants selling cloth, spices, and wine. Guilds controlled trades, ensuring standards for bakers, weavers, and blacksmiths. Stone churches and town walls rose, symbols of growing wealth. England was slowly becoming not just a land of villages, but of thriving towns and cities. The growth of law and parliament, the Plantagenet kings, despite their conflicts, strengthened the foundations of English law. Henry II established common law, sending royal judges across the kingdom to ensure justice was more uniform. Trials by jury slowly replaced older methods of trial by ordeal. By the 13th century, another innovation appeared: Parliament. What began as councils of nobles advising the king grew into assemblies, where knights and townsmen were also summoned. At first, it was simply a way for the king to raise taxes. But in time, Parliament would become a central institution of English government, representing a voice beyond the crown. Imagine the Great Hall at Westminster, filled with barons, bishops, and knights. The air is thick with the smell of wax candles, the murmur of debate, the clatter of boots on stone floors. Few could have known that these gatherings would lay the foundations of modern democracy, the world of chivalry and story. While kings fought and parliaments formed, the culture of the Middle Ages blossomed. Knights swore oaths of loyalty and honor. Troubadours sang of love and valor. The legend of King Arthur was retold and expanded, inspiring dreams of noble quests and round tables. In castles, tapestries adorned walls, telling stories of battles and hunts. Minstrels entertained lords with music and poetry. The ideals of chivalry, though often far removed from reality, captured the imagination of Europe. Yet beneath the glamour, life was still harsh. Knights rode to war, peasants bore the burden of labor, and women's lives were often confined to the home. Still, the stories gave meaning, painting a picture of a world where courage and honor mattered. Closing the chapter. The Plantagenet age was one of contrasts: ambition and failure, tyranny and justice, oppression, and the first stirrings of liberty. Kings sought power, but the people, through Magna Carta and Parliament, began to claim a voice. As you let this chapter settle in your mind, picture an evening in 13th century England. The sun sets over fields of ripening grain. In the village, families gather by firelight, the smell of smoke in the air. In a distant castle, a lord feasts beneath banners, while clerks in candlelit rooms copy charters and chronicles. And above all, the bells of the church ring out, steady and timeless. This was the England of the Plantagenets, an age of kings and charters, of law and legend, of faith and endurance. And soon, as centuries turn, the kingdom will rise into a new flowering of culture, learning and devotion, the High Middle Ages. The 13th and 14th centuries brought to England a period of flowering, of devotion, of art, of learning, and of architecture that still towers above us today. The wars rumbled at the edges and kings struggled with their nobles. This was also a time when culture blossomed, when faith was carved in stone, and when the rhythms of medieval life took on both grandeur and intimacy. The great cathedrals. If there is one enduring image of the High Middle Ages, it is the cathedral. Across the land, towns and cities poured their wealth, their labor, and their faith into building monumental houses of God. At Canterbury, at Lincoln, at York, the great cathedrals rose, stone by stone, arch by arch. They grew taller and more intricate, their spires reaching toward heaven. Inside, stained glass glowed like jewels, casting colored light on the stone floors. Images of saints and stories of the Bible unfolded across windows and walls, teaching the faithful through beauty. Imagine standing inside such a place on a quiet afternoon. The cool air of the nave wraps around you. Sunlight filters through stained glass, painting the floor with red and blue. The faint smell of incense lingers in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a choir's chant echoes, long notes rising and falling like waves. These cathedrals were not built in a year, or even in a generation. They were the work of centuries, with entire communities contributing their labor. Masons carved intricate stone, carpenters shaped beams for roofs, and glassmakers crafted dazzling windows. For the people of the Middle Ages, the cathedral was a mirror of heaven on earth, the most enduring symbol of their devotion. The rise of learning. Alongside the cathedrals, another kind of institution was born: the universities. At Oxford and Cambridge, students gathered to study under masters. Their subjects were theology, philosophy, law, and medicine. Picture the scene: a crowded hall, students wrapped in cloaks against the chill, scratching notes on parchment as a master lectured in Latin. The debates were lively, sometimes fiery, as young scholars argued about Aristotle, Augustine, or the nature of God. Books were precious, hand-copied by monks, chained to desks so they could not be stolen. To own even a single volume was a sign of great wealth. Yet despite their rarity, learning spread. Ideas crossed borders, carried by scholars who moved between Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and beyond. From these universities would emerge some of England's greatest minds. Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar, wrote of optics and natural science. Philosophers pondered the order of the cosmos, and over time, the English language itself began to find new power as writers sought to capture the world not only in Latin, but in the tongue of the people. Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. Perhaps the greatest voice of this age was Geoffrey Chaucer, who lived in the 14th century, a courtier and diplomat. Chaucer is remembered today for his masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales. In this work, pilgrims journey together to Canterbury, each telling a story to pass the time. There is the knight, noble and wise; the wife of Bath, bold and worldly; the miller, bawdy and irreverent. Each voice is distinct, filled with humor, wit, and humanity. Through Chaucer, we glimpse the diversity of medieval England, noblemen and peasants, clergy and merchants, women and men, each with their own perspective. His tales capture the liveliness of the age, the laughter and the flaws, the hopes and the contradictions. Imagine yourself traveling along the dusty road to Canterbury, in the company of these pilgrims. The sound of their stories drifts through the air, some amusing, some tragic, some profound. Together, they remind us that even in the grandeur of the Middle Ages, ordinary human voices still spoke with warmth and wit, the ideal of chivalry. Alongside this flowering of culture came the ideals of chivalry. Knights swore oaths of loyalty, courage, and courtesy. Tournaments filled fields with the clash of lances and the cheers of crowds. Troubadours sang of courtly love, weaving tales of knights and ladies, of quests and devotion. The legend of King Arthur was retold with new vigor, inspiring dreams of noble knights and round tables. Though often more fantasy than reality, these stories gave shape to the values of the time. Yet beneath the glittering ideals, the reality was harsher. Nights could be brutal, tournaments could be bloody, and the burdens of war often fell upon peasants who tilled the soil. Still, the stories endured, offering a vision of order and honor in a world that was often uncertain. Life in village and town. While cathedrals soared and knights jousted, most people lived simpler lives. The majority of England's population were peasants, bound to the land under the feudal system. Imagine a day in a medieval village. At dawn, the rooster crows. Families rise from straw beds, dressed in woolen tunics and cloaks. Men lead oxen to the fields, plowing strips of land shared among neighbors. Women tend gardens, bake bread, and spin wool. Children gather firewood, chase geese, or watch over sheep. The year was marked by cycles: sowing in spring, harvesting in autumn, winter evenings spent by the hearth. Feast days broke the routine with music, dancing, and the joy of community. The church bell called everyone to prayer, reminding them of the greater order of the world. In towns, life was different. Streets bustled with merchants selling cloth, spices, leather, and salt. Guilds controlled trades, ensuring quality and protecting their members. Markets rang with the cries of sellers, the clatter of carts, the smell of roasting meat. For both peasant and merchant, life was precarious, but it was also filled with color, rhythm, and the bonds of community, faith, art, and the sacred world. Faith infused every part of medieval existence. People believed the world was bound together by divine order. From the highest king to the humblest serf, saints were honored, relics treasured, and pilgrimages undertaken with devotion. Art reflected this sacred vision. Illuminated manuscripts, adorned with gold and vivid color, told stories of scripture and saints. Music filled churches, with Gregorian chant rising in solemn beauty. Even the simplest village church, with its stone walls and carved font, carried the weight of centuries of devotion. Imagine standing in such a church at dusk. A single candle flickers on the altar. The air smells faintly of wax and smoke. Outside, the wind rustles through trees, but within, all is quiet. For the medieval mind, the sacred was not far away, but woven into every part of life. Closing the chapter. The High Middle Ages left us with treasures that endure, cathedrals that still touch the sky, poetry that still speaks with warmth, and a vision of life where faith, art, and community were inseparable. As you let this chapter drift into your thoughts, imagine England not as a battlefield, but as a land alive with beauty, spires rising against the sky, scholars debating in cloisters, pilgrims sharing stories on the road, peasants working fields under the steady toll of bells. This was England at its cultural height, a realm of devotion and imagination, of learning and laughter, of labor and love. And yet, even as this age blossomed, shadows gathered on the horizon. Soon England would be drawn into a long war with France. and a plague would sweep the land, reshaping everything. The cultural flowering of medieval England could not last forever. By the 14th century, the realm was drawn into two of the most defining events of the age: a long and bitter conflict with France, remembered as the 100 Years' War, and the devastation of the Black Death, a plague that would sweep away nearly half the population. The road to war, the story of the 100 Years' War, begins with questions of inheritance and kingship. In 1328, the French king died without a direct male heir. The English king, Edward III, whose mother was French, claimed the crown of France, but the French nobility rejected his claim, choosing another. What followed was not a single war, but a series of campaigns and truces stretching for more than a century. For generations, English kings would lay claim to the French throne, and armies would march across fields and valleys, clashing in battles that echoed through history. The English longbow, one of the most striking features of the war, was the use of the longbow, a weapon that changed the nature of battle. English archers drawn from villages and towns could shoot arrows with deadly speed and force. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, Edward III's forces faced a much larger French army. As the French knights charged wave after wave, the English archers loosed their arrows. Horses fell, knights stumbled, the field became chaos. The mighty cavalry of France was humbled by common archers. Imagine the sky darkened by arrows, the whistle of their flight, the sudden thud as they struck shields and armor. From that day on, the longbow was feared as a weapon that could topple even the proudest knight. A decade later, at Poitiers, the English again triumphed, and later still in 1415, at the Battle of Agincourt, King Henry V led a weary army to one of the most famous victories in English history. Surrounded, outnumbered, and mired in mud, the English once more relied on their longbowmen. The French knights, heavily armored, were trapped and slaughtered. Henry's victory made him a legend. Chroniclers described him as the very model of a Christian king. Humble and pious, yet fierce in war, his triumph seemed to promise English rule over France itself. The shadow of Joan of Arc, but the war did not belong to England alone. In the 1420s, a remarkable figure rose in France, Joan of Arc, a young peasant girl. She claimed to be guided by visions and voices from God. She led French armies to victories, lifting the siege of Orléans and inspiring her people with courage. Though captured and burned at the stake by the English, Joan's legacy endured. For France, she became a saintly heroine. For England, she was a symbol of their waning power. The tide of war turned. By the mid-15th century, most of England's territories in France were lost. Calais remained, but the dream of an English crown over France had faded. The Black Death arrives. Even as battles raged abroad, a darker enemy struck at home. In 1348, a terrible plague swept across Europe, carried by ships from the east. It was known as the Black Death. The disease spread quickly, through flea bites and through the air. People developed swellings, fevers, and chills. Many died within days. Entire villages fell silent. Fields lay untended. The sound of church bells tolling for the dead became constant, until even bells fell silent when no one was left to ring them. Imagine the terror of those days. A village suddenly struck, families huddling together, prayers whispered desperately, candles burning in crowded churches, the roads filled with processions of the dying and the dead. In London, pits were dug where bodies were laid in great numbers. Without name or marker, it is said that in just a few short years, perhaps half of England's population was gone. The memory of the plague haunted survivors, reshaping their view of life, death, and the world itself. The aftermath of the plague. Yet even in devastation, change took root. With so many lives lost, labor became scarce. Peasants began to demand higher wages and better conditions. The rigid structures of feudalism began to weaken. In 1381, frustration erupted in the peasants' revolt. men and women from villages marched on London, demanding freedom from oppressive taxes and feudal burdens. Though the revolt was suppressed, its spirit lingered. The old order was trembling. The church, too, faced challenge. Many had died, priests and monks among them. Some questioned the wealth and corruption of the clergy. Voices called for reform, for a faith closer to the simplicity of Christ's teachings. Among them was John Wycliffe, who translated the Bible into English, making it accessible to common people. His followers, known as the Lollards, spread ideas that foreshadowed later Reformation. Life amid war and plague. Amid the turmoil, life still carried on. Villagers still sowed their fields. Mothers still sang lullabies. Bells still rang on feast days. Children grew up playing in meadows, chasing geese, and watching puppet plays at fairs. In towns, merchants continued to trade. Markets bustled and guilds thrived. Plays and pageants, often with religious themes, entertained crowds in public squares. Even in times of fear, laughter and joy found their place. The medieval mind held both sorrow and hope together. The plague was seen as punishment, but also as a call to renewal. The war was bitter, but stories of courage, like those of Henry V or Joan of Arc, gave meaning to struggle. Closing the chapter. The 14th and 15th centuries left deep marks on England. The 100 Years' War gave rise to legends of triumph and loss, shaping English identity. The Black Death transformed society, breaking the chains of the old order and planting seeds of change. As you let this chapter drift in your thoughts, picture England at dusk. The fields are quiet, the air heavy with the scent of earth after rain. In the distance, a church bell tolls, solemn, enduring. Somewhere, an archer practices with his longbow, his arrows thudding into a target of straw. Somewhere else, a mother gathers her children inside, lighting a small candle against the dark. This was an England of trial and endurance, of sorrow and resilience. And soon as the 15th century waned, another storm would rise, a storm of civil war, as great families fought for the crown itself. The century turns once more, and with it comes a storm unlike any England has faced before. Not an invasion from across the sea, nor a plague carried by unseen winds, but a war that rises from within. Brother will turn against brother, noble against noble, as rival branches of the royal family claim the right to rule. This is the story of the Wars of the Roses, a civil war that will last for 3 decades, scattering lives and crowns like leaves in a restless wind. The failing reign of Henry VI. The roots of the struggle lie in the troubled reign of Henry VI, the grandson of Henry V, the great victor at Agincourt, where his father had been bold, determined, and admired. Henry VI was gentle, pious, and fragile. He loved prayer, scholarship, and quiet, but he lacked the strong will to govern a kingdom that demanded firmness. At times, Henry's mind clouded into illness, leaving him incapable of ruling. During these episodes, his queen, Margaret of Anjou, a woman of strength and determination, struggled to protect his crown. Yet her assertive hand earned enemies among the nobles, who saw her as overreaching and foreign. England, weakened by defeats in the last stages of the 100 Years' War, grew restless. Fields in France that had once flown the banner of St. George were lost, and soldiers returned bitter, jobless, and poor. Taxes rose, tempers frayed, and many began to question whether Henry was fit to wear the crown. York and Lancaster, the royal house of Plantagenet, had branched into 2 great lines: the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, represented by the white rose. The head of the Yorkist line was Richard, Duke of York, a powerful noble with a strong blood claim to the throne. Richard was ambitious, intelligent, and determined to play a greater role in the kingdom's rule. He gathered allies among the barons, who had grown weary of Henry's weakness and Margaret's influence. What began as political rivalry soon escalated into open war. The First Battles. 1455, the first battle was fought at St. Albans. It was not a massive clash, but it marked the beginning of a cycle that would spin for 30 years. Alliances formed, armies gathered, steel rang against steel, and the crown shifted from head to head. Battles followed across the land. Wakefield, Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury. Each left scars not only on noble families, but on villages and fields where armies marched. Towton, fought in 1461, stands out as one of the bloodiest battles in English history. Imagine snow falling thick across the Yorkshire countryside, the wind howling, the clash of tens of thousands of men locked in combat. The snow turned red with blood, and corpses lay strewn across the fields for days. Chroniclers claim that more than 20,000 died in a single day. From this carnage, the Yorkist claimant Edward IV emerged as king. The rise of Edward IV. Edward IV was everything Henry VI was not. Tall, strong, charismatic, and decisive. At only 19, he seized the crown after Towton, sweeping into London as the new monarch. The people, weary of weak leadership, greeted him with hope. Edward was a king of contrasts. He was a skilled warrior, but also a man of charm, fond of feasting, hunting, and pleasure. His court was lively, filled with music and pageantry. Yet he was also pragmatic, strengthening royal finances and securing trade. For a time, it seemed the wars might quiet under Edward's steady hand. But civil wars are rarely so simple. Rivalries smoldered, alliances cracked, and soon the realm was thrown back into turmoil. Richard Neville, the Kingmaker. One of the most fascinating figures of the wars was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, remembered as the Kingmaker. At first, Warwick was Edward's staunch supporter, helping him win his crown. But over time, he grew resentful of Edward's independence, especially when Edward married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner widow, rather than the foreign Princess Warwick had planned for him. Disgusted, Warwick turned against his king. At one point, he even restored Henry VI to the throne, bringing the old Lancastrian king back to London in a strange, brief revival of his reign. But Henry was too weak, too frail to hold power. Before long, Warwick himself was defeated and slain at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. With Warwick gone and Henry VIII dead soon after, Edward IV ruled securely for the rest of his life. His reign brought a measure of peace, but the seeds of discord remained. Richard III and the princes in the Tower. When Edward III died in 1483, his young son Edward V was declared king, but the boy was only 12, and power fell into the hands of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Soon whispers spread. Richard declared the young king and his brother illegitimate, and he took the crown for himself as Richard III. The boys, kept in the Tower of London, disappeared. Their fate remains a mystery, but many believed Richard had them killed. Richard's reign was brief, troubled by suspicion and rebellion. He was a capable administrator and soldier, but his reputation was haunted by the shadow of the missing princes. The crown sat uneasy on his head, Bosworth Field. In 1485, Richard faced a new challenger, Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian heir who had lived much of his life in exile. Henry landed in Wales, gathered supporters, and marched to confront Richard at Bosworth Field. The battle was decisive. Richard fought bravely, refusing to flee even as the tide turned against him. Chroniclers say he cried out for a horse as his own was slain beneath him. Surrounded, Richard was cut down, the last English king to die on the battlefield. Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII on the field itself. By marrying Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, he united the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York into the Tudor Rose, symbol of peace and unity. The ordinary people. For nobles, the wars meant crowns won and lost, fortunes made and ruined. For ordinary people, the experience was different. Villages feared the approach of armies, for soldiers would seize food, burn houses, and press men into service. Imagine living in a small village during these years. One week, the men march out under a Yorkist banner. Months later, a Lancastrian force comes through, demanding loyalty instead. Families had little say. Survival meant bending like grass in the wind. Yet even in these unsettled times, life's rhythms endured. Crops were planted, children were baptized. Festivals were celebrated when peace allowed. The church bells still marked the hours, reminding people that life was more than politics, that faith and community endured even through war. The Wars of the Roses were a storm of ambition, betrayal, and blood. Kings rose and fell, nobles changed sides, and for 30 years England staggered under the weight of civil war. Yet from the storm came a new dynasty, the Tudors, who would guide the nation into the modern age. The field at Bosworth has grown quiet. The banners have been gathered in, the ravens have flown on, and the crown, mud-stained, bent a little at the rim, has found a new brow. With Henry VII, a cautious, deliberate king, the long turbulence of civil war begins to fade like the last rumble of distant thunder. The Middle Ages in England do not end with a sudden crack, but with a long exhale, a slow, steady tidying up of frayed edges, a careful binding of wounds. Imagine for a moment, walking through London in the late 15th century. The day opens over the Thames like a silver mirror, barges nudging along in the current, gulls calling above the roofs of timbered houses. The bells of parish churches mark the hours, and the smell of bread begins to drift from the bakeries. A city watchman stamps his feet at a corner, warming himself in the cool, while apprentices carrying bundles hurry into lanes with cheerful shouts. This is a city still medieval in its lanes and guilds and parish life, yet somehow already leaning forward, peering into a new dawn. Henry VII understands better than most the cost of disunity. He has seen noble houses rise and shatter. He has lived the cold uncertainty of exile. Now, with the crown at last in his keeping, he sets about mending the kingdom with the patient hands of a tailor working a heavy cloth. He prefers order to glory. He will trim the power of overmighty lords, strengthen the royal finances, and make it costly to play at private war. Bonds and recognizances, those paper, threads of promises and penalties bind ambitious men to good behavior. It is not a romance of banners in the wind, but the slow weaving of a net to catch disorder before it sparks. If you step into a noble household in these years, you will find echoes of the old feudal world. Great halls, tapestries, retainers in livery. Yet you will also notice the quiet arrival of new habits. Accounts are kept carefully. Letters and warrants move briskly. Rooms are smaller and more private than the old echoing chambers. The kitchen bustles with spices that once seemed rare. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, brought by merchants whose ventures knit England more tightly to Flanders, to Iberia, to the wider sea roads. In London's bookshops, the future has already slipped in through a wooden door. William Caxton's press, set humming in the 1470s, has multiplied words like seed flung across a field. Where once a clerk might copy a book for months, now pages leap into being with a clatter and sigh of ink and type. The old miracle of the scriptorium still glows in illuminated manuscripts, but paper cheaper than parchment carries sermons and romances and chronicles into humbler hands. The English tongue, once tangled between Norman French and Old Saxon speech, now shows a gathering confidence. The language of Chaucer and of guild ordinances and of market cries begins to feel like one river, deepening its channel. Walk out beyond the city, and the countryside keeps its rhythm. Villages still cluster around their churches, and the year still turns by the plow. Yet change creeps like ivy along the hedgerow. Sheep graze on fields that once were open strips. Wool, England's soft treasure, feeds, looms in Flemish towns and fills the purses of merchants at home. Enclosure begins to nibble at the old communal way, and voices murmur at new fences. The market grows stronger as a judge of what is sown and shorn. In manor courts, the old feudal dues are argued more as contracts than as ancient, unquestionable customs. In a small parish church, you may see the age's piety at its richest and its most homely. Candles burn before statues bright with color. Wall paintings tell the gospel in reds and blues to eyes that cannot read. Chantries are endowed for souls to be remembered at altars. Guilds of craft and devotion maintain lights, care for the poor, and bring neighbors together beneath a patron saint. The air holds the scent of beeswax and damp stone. A mother hushes a child while the priest lifts the host, and the bell in the sanctus window rings like a drop of bright water. This is a world where the unseen is near, where saints are neighbors, and where the bones of holiness rest in jeweled boxes. Architecture, too, takes a late medieval flourish. Perpendicular Gothic sends windows up like sheets of crystal. Fan vaults spread stone into lacy canopies that seem too delicate to hold their own weight. Think of King's College Chapel at Cambridge, a ship of stone riding an inland sea of fields. Think of the Lady Chapel at Westminster, where stone ribs curve and blossom overhead like carved clouds. These are dreams translated into mortar, the last flowering of an art that learned, over centuries, how to make weight rise lightly. Yet the world of war changes its character. The knight in plate is still a splendid figure, but gunpowder whispers of new balances. Castles, once the hard fists of power, grow quaint in the face of cannon. Kings will look more to money, ships, and trained soldiers than to the summons of armored lords. In quiet armories and foundries, the future taps softly at the door. There are hints, too, of inward stirrings. Lollard ideas seeded in the last century still germinate in hidden corners. English Bibles passed hand to hand. Prayers said in kitchens rather than in chancels. Officially, the old faith stands whole and radiant, and will do so for now. But questions have a way of traveling like embers on the wind, landing where none expect, glowing unseen until a breeze of events fans them bright. At the court, ceremony glitters yet serves a practical purpose. Henry arranges marriages like a chess master, securing alliances that stitch his fragile peace to other thrones. He counts coins, not crusades, as the measure of safety. He is not beloved for grandeur. He is tolerated for stability. And stability is the weary kingdom's dearest wish. Under his hand, merchants venture further. The merchant adventurers carry cloth to Antwerp, and the ledger, with its neat lines of figures, becomes a scripture of its own sort. Meanwhile, in homes across England, the small facts of life keep time. A girl learns to spin thread fine and even. A boy practices letters by tracing them on a tablet of wax. A father teaches his son the measure of a field, the signs of weather on the hedgerow, the way a lamb's ear feels between finger and thumb. A mother shows her daughter how to keep yeast alive for the next loaf, how to steep herbs for a cough, how to fold linens neatly so they last through winter. In the yard, geese gossip. In the loft, apples slowly sweeten the air. The kingdom may be learning new arithmetic, but in the cottage, care is counted the old way, in small kindnesses and well-remembered tasks. As day declines, the Thames dims to pewter. A ferry creaks at its rope. A prayer drifts from a window where someone sits with a rosary, beads, clicking softly like rain on eaves. If you listen closely, the city seems to breathe. The mill's tailwind turning, a porter's cart rumbling, a dog giving a sleepy bark in some mews. Tomorrow will be much like today. A generation ago it was not. That sameness is the point. A steadying of the heart after years of racing. And so the medieval age does not break, it settles. The past does not vanish, it ripens. Under Henry's cautious hand, under Guildhall and parish steeple, under the new print shops and the old stalls of the shambles, England gathers itself. It is a country beginning to speak in one voice, with one coin and one crown's careful custody. Soon other winds will rise, winds of reform and of ocean voyages, of scholars peering at Greek texts and ships feeling for western shores. But that is for another night. For now, set your hand on the cool stone of a church pillar. Feel the centuries there layered like rings in a tree. Hear the bell call for Compline, last prayers at day's end. The Tudor dawn has come, but the light is still gentle. And the long medieval evening, its bells, its fields, its stories, sighs itself to rest. Good night, medieval England, your halls and hedges, your charter chests and chantries, your chalk downs and cobbled quays. Good night to every pilgrim and every ploughman, to every clerk with inky fingers, to every mason who found a way to make stone behave like air. Good night to kings who chased brightness and to mothers who simply kept the light. You may rest.